Welcome again to another episode of Think with a Drink. This is the weekly series brought to you by the ARIES Foundation for Financial Education. This week's episode is making buying a car more fun, or trying to do that in some way or another. Next slide. So real quick, just so you know that the event is pre-recorded. There will be a chat box that will be available, so if you do ever have questions, you can drop it in, and one of Craig or myself will get back to you with that, so we will follow up next. And just real quick, your presenters for this evening in terms of, my name is Tom Alessi. I am the president of the ARIES Foundation. I have been in financial services for the past 23 years. I'm an investment advisor, which means I act as a fiduciary whenever giving advice or guidance to any of my clients. I'm going to bring my co-president, my vice president, not co-president. I haven't upgraded him yet in terms of that. My vice president, Craig, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Craig Richardson. I am the vice president of the ARIES Foundation. I've been in the financial services world a little over 17 years now. And I work with families and small businesses, helping them develop a financial plan so they can have a better relationship with their money.
Tremendous. Next slide. So Craig will be chiming in as we go along. We told you that the episodes are sponsored by the ARIES Foundation for Financial Education. We are a nonprofit located here in Newton. You can visit our website, www.ariesfoundation.org. But our mission statement is trying to help everyone have a better relationship with their money. Because whether you realize it or not, you're in a relationship with your money, and just like every other personal relationship that you might have, there are behaviors and emotional triggers that can cause us to sometimes act, well, let's face it, a little irrationally sometimes when it comes to handling our money. So what Craig and I, our whole mission is about, is trying to take some of that emotion out of dealing with your finances. Next slide is disclosures. I'm not going to read through all of these disclosures. Just know we're a nonprofit. We do this as an educational and informational outreach. So we share all of this information. We share it on YouTube. We share it on the website. We share it on the new TV channel that you can check out in Newton. So just know that if you're going to share it, just do it in an educational manner. Next slide. Well, that was a lot of talking for me. So to get to the fun part, we call this Think with a Drink. And the reason for that is we want the information to be educational, but we also want it to be in more casual, more relaxed manner. So we can't think of a better way to do that than if we have something cold to sip on as Craig and I go along in this. Hopefully the audience is joining in with us. Tonight we are drinking, this is Down East cider. This is their unfiltered version of it. Craig is more of a fan of the ciders than I am.
I am.
But we would say skål.
Skål.
Next slide. So the agenda, what we're going to try to do this evening is we're going to try to, give you a little bit of ideas and tips and thoughts about researching the type of car, figuring out how to pay for it, which is the biggest part, right, in terms of dealing with everything. The process in terms of acquiring or searching for the car, and then, ultimately making the purchase. Next slide. All right, so getting ready to hit the road, right? So one of the things with any time you're going to make a major purchase, right, is to take your time, right? Do your research, stay in control. Don't get emotional, right?
In love with a car, right?
Yes, right. Don't fall in love with the deal, whatever it is, before you really have time to go through all of it, and know in advance what you can afford. That's going to be one of the biggest things in terms of this. Next slide. All right, so we're just following through with that, right? So one of the things with anything, right, whether we're talking about a car, whether we're talking about a home, anything that's going to involve ongoing costs, you need to be figuring that in. That's got to be part of the budget in terms of going through that.
Right.
And we'll talk about that and we go through it. Saving money. Are there ways that you can save money? Ways and ideas and thoughts that you can do that where you're going to be saving a little bit of money by doing a little bit of research or thinking about what type or what year model that you're going to purchase. And you got to make sure you fall in love with it, because God bless if you buy something that you don't love.
I think we just told them not to fall in love with it.
Oh, we did?
Yes.
No. It's once you buy it, though.
Oh, once you buy it, then it's okay to love it.
Yeah, because it's not like, hey, I bought this car, and now, 6 months later, I hate being in it.
Or don't let anybody know you love it till you buy it.
Yeah. There's a good point. Yes. Next slide. All right. So, the idea is getting a rough idea of what you want and what you need. Find out whether or not you can actually afford this car, and really do some serious research on it. You know, it's as Craig said, don't fall in love with, oh, I love the way that car looks, I want to buy that, right? Do some research behind it, get a little bit of idea, and figure out how you are going to pay for it. You know, sort of seems redundant, but it's going to keep coming back to that. Next. Right? So a lot of times what we suggest for people, like anybody who's going to start looking for a car, just start looking at cars. And by that, I mean you're out all the time, right? Whether you're in a car and driving, whether you're in a parking lot and just looking at cars to sort of give you a sense of, gee, I could see myself in this vehicle versus that vehicle type of thing.
Well, I think the other thing too you were alluding to in the last slide was, you know, what's your need, right? So if I'm 22, single guy, you know, maybe I'm driving a Mustang, or I'm 55 and with no kids in the back seat, I'm driving a Mustang, right? Or if I'm 35 with 3 kids, you know, I may be needing an SUV, or I may need a, you know, a utility vehicle, or the dreaded minivan.
Minivan. I'm
right?
trying to think of what that is. That, yeah, the minivan. Yes.
Right.
Next slide. Right. So just like Craig said, right. So you're starting with that idea of not only my needs,
Yep.
right, what I'm going to have, but also, let's face it, we're here in Boston, we're in New England. You've got to be thinking about adverse weather conditions, right? So for those of us who do drive a car that does not really go well in the adverse weather conditions, we know that the next car will, basically, in terms of going through that.
Tom drives a Mustang,
Yes.
convertible.
I drive a convertible.
Perfectly suited for New England.
Yeah, just great for the weather. Really. You might as well have, you know, 8 reindeer out in front of the thing, and once the weather comes in. Yes.
It's a sled, yes.
Yes. So consider the wants, right? So, you know, again, convenience, things that are there, and then understand, like, hey, even though maybe that's what I want, I got to pull back my needs and my concerns with that a little bit. Next slide. So let's talk about, you know, purchasing, making the purchase, right, and looking at average cost. So one of the tips is to not look at something that's going to cost you more than half of what you currently earn. So the idea is, think of that, you know, the slide should say it's like somebody who's making $24,000 a year should not really be looking at a car that's going to cost more than $12,000. That's just going to give you a baseline to be consideration for how much I'm making and what I can really afford. Mm-hmm. Because then we'll talk, and it's funny, probably down the road here, whenever we do budgeting, we talk about transportation cost. And transportation really shouldn't take more than, in this case it says 15%, but it's usually in that range, right? 15 to about 18%.
Yeah, it is. Yep.
When you factor everything in. And by that we mean the cost of the vehicle, gas, insurance, maintenance, all of that stuff shouldn't be more than 15%. And that's where some of us get a little crazy, want to buy a bigger, better, more improved car, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, which we can get carried away and end up, you know, paying 25, 30% of our income on transportation costs, which is how we get into trouble.
Well, I guess the issue is, are you buying transportation or a status symbol?
Yes, and that's,
right.
We'll talk about that and going through it, because that is part of the problem. Next slide. Right? So this just talks a little bit about places to go. Like yes, you can go to all of the sites out there, you know, for internet purchasing. I think we put Auto Trader on there as one of the places to go, but you want to do some research before that, right? So Consumer Reports, fueleconomy.gov, if you're somebody who's really concerned who does a lot of traveling, a lot of driving in a vehicle, then you want to make sure you've got you know, a high miles per gallon, right? MPG. God bless, I got an acronym I got thrown off.
All right, you're looking for fuel economy. You're probably not driving a diesel, right?
Yes. You know, or some very, very large 8-cylinder vehicle type of thing. That's not going to work for you.
Yeah. Well, the other thing you want to do too is, you know, some cars are prone to different types of issues, and you want to get an idea of what kind of factory recalls are out there for different types of vehicles, especially used vehicles, before you buy them. The other thing you can also do is I mean, you have this later, is you can go to like these car checks where you can check the VIN number to see if the car you're looking at actually buying has had any previous issues, whether it's been in an accident, been in a flood, or those types of deals. And sometimes you just got to be careful. If the deal looks too good to be true, there's usually something going on where it's too good to be true. So.
And there's usually something to be wary of. Next slide. Right, so, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about budgeting, But that's ultimately what we're talking about. And unfortunately, Craig and I, we hate to use the word budget. We'd talk more about, how you spend your money than anything else. But that's really what it's going to come down to. You got to know how much of a percentage this is going to take from your net take home and how you're going to allocate that. And until you figure that out, this whole thing becomes just really air. It becomes hope and want, and that's not something that you want to do. So you got to really get a handle on what you're spending and then how you're going to fit this into your monthly budget to make sure you can do all the things you want to do. And the last one there is revise your choice if necessary, right? So, again, like Craig said, you want to make sure there's a lot that you do as far as the research on this. And once you've narrowed yourself down, you want to make sure that you've got that handle on it in terms of the specific vehicle, but then to go through and do a little bit more deeper dive into if you've come across a vehicle that you want to purchase, like Craig said, in terms of going through that. Insurance, if you're a younger driver, be prepared. You're going to pay more. And, even as an older driver, if all you got to do is take 1 or 2 dings, in terms of that, and it's going to increase but you've got to factor the insurance cost along with the monthly vehicle cost plus maintenance and upkeep.
Right.
Next. All right, so, more of this serious research on it, right, because that's the thing. I mean, we Craig and I talk to people all the time, especially when it talks about, home ownership and car ownership, about thinking, what are these ongoing costs going to be? And it's not just, hey, I'm buying the car and the car is costing me, whatever, $300, $400 a month. I've got insurance cost. I got oil changes. I've got other, upkeep and maintenance that go on. I got to register the vehicle. I got to get inspections done.
Right, and also depending on the make and model of the car, maintenance can be a severely different cost, right? If I'm driving a Chevy, it may be a lot cheaper to fix than, say, a Mercedes, right? So, I got a great deal on this luxury car, but now I can't afford it if it needs a repair. So those are other things you want to look at, and so those consumer report things will tell you average cost of maintenance and care on a car, not just the cost of the car.
And we'll talk about that at the end. We've got some sites to go to next. Right, so paying for the car, right? Here comes the biggest part of this, right? So how am I paying for it? And one of the things that Craig and I always talk to everybody about is about saving up for a down payment. Making sure that money is put away, because the more money you have for that down payment, obviously the less you're going to be financing, the less of a debt you're going to be taking on. So if you can build up some sort of a cash reserve that you can use for a down payment, you're going to be in a better place. Right. Yes, if you have a trade-in, you can use that as a partial down payment or a portion of it in terms of that, right? If you're getting a tax refund, we've talked about this in the past about whether or not it makes sense or it's a good idea to get a tax refund, but there's another way to say, well, I know at that time I'm going to be getting this money. I can use that as my down payment or a portion of it that I'm saving towards, or put it aside and say I'm going to purchase the car in 3 months or 6 months from there.
Yeah, I mean, you have to remember as you're buying a depreciating asset, that's an asset that's going down in value. As soon as you purchase even a brand new car off the lot, it goes down by almost 20% as soon as you drive it off. So when you're looking at financing, the more money you can put down, the less you have to finance, the less it's costing you over the long run. And you don't want to have a loan still due when you're looking to trade this car in or it's met its demise.
Right. Next one. Right. So then we get into loans, right? And so one of the things that comes up with loans, and there's the note on there, it's about teaser rates, right? So those teaser rates, and you see that all the time, especially credit cards, especially with, store purchases, right? Buy it now, we're going to give you 0% for X amount of time, so long as you continue to make it, or if you pay it off in that period of time. If you don't, then what's going to happen is we're going to retro all the way back to day one, and we're going to put you in at a 15 or 16 or 20 or whatever the number is, because God bless, they can go all the way into the 20s in terms of a percentage rate, all the way for the whole life of that loan, which is going to amount to thousands of dollars if you get caught with it. So one of the things is just be wary of that whenever you see any, rates like that. Unfortunately, we're in a time frame where interest rates are very, very low. So it's always a way to look at it and negotiate and go through and figure out, who's giving me the best rate and where can I get that from. Next slide. So again, that's the idea. You can flip here because this just talks about the cost, of a 15-year or $15,000 loan, right, at 2.75%, I think we said, for somebody who's, that's excellent credit. Who knows, in today's world, you can probably get it cheaper, but we're just using it for example purposes. So that would be $289 a month for a 5-year note, which makes that $15,000 car $17,358 or something like that, right? In terms of it. But if you've got less than excellent credit, and we did a whole thing on credit rating, and the numbers in terms of going through that, you can see it goes from $289 to $372, and the cost of that $15,000 car goes from $17 to $22. That's $5,000 difference, just because of where you are. So it might be, if you're thinking about this, and that was the lesson we did with credit rating, right, was look at getting your credit rating increased, improved before you go to make the major purchase.
Right.
Because those percentage points will help. Next slide. Leasing versus buying. This is more of a, type of person that you are. Leasing is just that. You're going to pay for it for a certain amount of time. Usually it's a 3-year lease. Usually it's 12,000 miles a year that you'll get, that you can use it for. And then at the end of the 3 years, you just give it back. You didn't get anything for it. You don't have anything in for it. You just paid for the time and the use of the vehicle. For some people, if they're not into ownership and want to do it, it's a way to get into a vehicle. But this is, you're not building up towards anything. You've now just paid for this. Like Craig said, it's a depreciating asset anyway.
Well, the other thing you got to be cognizant of when you're leasing is because it's basically you're renting a vehicle from somebody. They're telling you how many miles you can drive it, what kind of condition it has to be in when you bring it back in. So you got to be very careful when you're looking at all the fine print about what if I go over the miles?
Right.
What if there's a ding in the car? What kind of damages will actually be covered? Will I have to pay additional money to get out of the lease if I needed to get out of it early? So, all those factors come in, just like when you're leasing an apartment.
Right.
The same type of thing, I got to put a security deposit down. What happens if all these things happen? So that doesn't come in when you own the vehicle. You can do whatever you want to it. You own it. Drive it as far as you want. But once again, it's a matter of how much am I driving, how much do I need the vehicle, and what can I afford to take care of.
Right, and one of the other things with that, just as Craig is mentioning, one of the things is that because it is a leased vehicle, you do have to have a certain amount of upkeep. And there's a certain amount of insurance that has to be on that vehicle because it is a leased vehicle, which can increase the overall cost. So while it might look like, hey, I'm getting a good deal here, when you factor in I can only drive for a certain period or a certain amount of time, and I've got to have this additional insurance on it because it's a new vehicle and it's a lease, suddenly that becomes, wait, would I have been better off? And so that's why I think we put on there, smartaboutmoney.org, another nonprofit that you can go through and take a look at and just see whether or not that's something that makes sense, whether or not leasing or buying would be right for you. Next slide. All right, so shopping for cars, there's different ways to do this as far as going through and looking at, shopping and doing it. For most people, they do the research on their own. There are organizations out there that will help with that and go through it. We will drop a couple of those at the end of the presentation. But just know there are different places you can go to help you in that car buying search. You don't have to do it all on your own. Most people end up doing it on their own, but just know there are places you can go. Next. Right? So this becomes the what am I buying? And if we're talking about a new car, talking about buying last year's model, right? Because let's face it, the car didn't really change all that much. There are some times where they will make some changes, but it's last year's model, and now they want to sell this year's model.
If they have this year's model, I know they're having a chip issue, right? A lot of cars are manufacturers are having trouble getting new cars on the lot.
Yes, that just happens to be where we are with the
in this environment
post-pandemic
right
thing
now,
in terms of that. But in most cases, you're buying last year's model, you're usually going to get a better discount.
Yes.
There are certain periods of time in the year that you can purchase last year's model, or when they are preparing to get the new models in, and so they're clearing space on a lot is usually what happens there. the whole idea is it talks about buying a car from family or friends and where that can be an issue, right? And why that might be not the best thing to do, because what happens if you run into issues with the car, right? You know, this is something that becomes a hard thing to say, well, look, I want to give it back. You know, it didn't work. It wasn't good, right, as far as that's concerned. So just realize that can be a consequence. Next. So you always want to make sure that you're driving it, right? Make sure you're taking it out. You're using it everywhere that you're probably going to be driving it, whether that's highways, hills, you know, parking, moving. You want to make sure you're comfortable in the thing that, you know, as much as possible when you're dealing with it, because the last thing you want to do is find out you get out onto the highway and you're terrified driving the car. So not a good feeling. You just want to make sure you're driving it. Next. Right? So this one is something that Craig and I talk to everybody about, which is, and hey, what do you know? I'm going to use this pun intended, pumping the brakes, right? So you basically want to pump the brakes anytime you're going to make a major purchase. You want to make sure that it's something that, you know, come back, whether it's 24 hours or 2 or 3 days, that you have the same love for it, as Craig mentioned before, right? So, hey, I absolutely love this vehicle. I want to buy it, but let me pump the brakes. Let me take a step back. It's wants versus needs. Am I going to feel the same way 2 days later or 3 days later? And if you do, that's fine. Then go ahead with it. But sometimes we can have the ability to, you know, sort of rationalize, go through things in our mind and come back with it and say, well, maybe I'm better served finding something else. It's just a way of offsetting, because what happens a lot of times is buyer's remorse, right? You know.
Can be.
So this way you sort of pump that or stop that in case of going through it. Next. Right? So this talks about buying the new cars. You know, for most people, that's probably where you're going to go, because you know, it's a new car and that's what I want. But there are ways to get discounts on the new cars. We already talked about shopping last year's model, maybe shopping the car that's been sitting out there or been used for more test drives in terms of going through it, that type of thing. You know, see what they're giving for warranties. And a lot of cars nowadays are coming with, you know, like 100,000 miles,
right.
you know, 10-year warranties type of thing. So, you know, today's vehicles are much safer, last a lot longer than vehicles in the past, but still something to look at. Next. So used cars. This is what Craig was talking about. You know, you want to make sure and take a look at and understand the ins and outs of what you're getting when you're buying a used car. And Craig mentioned, you know, going to some of those like Carfax or some of the others that are going to give you the vehicle history, because that's important. You want to know what's happened with that vehicle. You want to know how many owners there have been. Are there any reported accidents? What are the recalls that have been on that vehicle?
Whether they've been serviced or not, right?
Right, yeah. Has the recall been done? That type of thing. So just always do it. And like Craig said, you can look up the VIN number. You can just pump the VIN number in and it'll give you all the information about the car if you're looking at a specific vehicle. Next. Right, so know the lemon laws. And the lemon laws are basically you have the ability to return the car within 30 days, something like that.
Yeah, depending on the state,
Yeah, so each state is different. So
it has to pass inspection. Right?
Yeah, right, got to pass inspection to go through it. Next slide. All right, so completing the process, right? So this is negotiation, and not everybody is very good at negotiation. But you just want to have a price in mind. You want to know what you want to pay. You've done your research. You've got your information. You've figured out this is the price. This is what I want to pay. This is what I feel comfortable with. And go in with that in mind. Right. You know, if you really start talking to them about, hey, you know, timing, they want to move the car, maybe you can get a little bit of a discount. Maybe you get some other things thrown in to go along with it. But don't get talked off of what you wanted to pay. There's going to be another car, similar car at another dealer someplace else.
Yeah, millions and millions of cars out there. And people are buying thousands of them every day. So yeah, you let one car go, you'll find another.
Next slide. Right, so just understand it's a process. You need to make sure you've got the money set aside, you've got the budget set up for it so you don't get in over your head. And then research. Understand where you're going. Next slide, because we'll talk about the resources, right? So, you know, Consumer Reports, you know, the fuel economy, USA.gov, I don't know, jumped ahead of me, but that's okay. It's all right. You need a clear vision of the road ahead. That's what ARIES is here for. Next slide. So, you know, everybody has a plan, just not necessarily put into place. You can hit the button, which it'll say, look, in the chat box, if you want us to reach out and do anything or answer any questions, you can type yes. Like I said, it can be interactive, so you can do that. Next slide. So this is Craig and I in our more formal attire. Yes, those are TB12 jerseys. He's not playing for the Patriots any longer, but he is the greatest of all time. So we'll still continue to wear those jerseys until he retires, or we can find Mac Jones jerseys, which are very, very difficult and tough to find. Next slide. All right, so Think with a Drink, like we said, you know, these episodes, they're available on our YouTube channel. They're available on our website. They're available on New TV. Some of them you can find that, newtv.org. You can look that up as far as the show is concerned. Next slide. But if you ever have any questions, you ever need any help, anything, you can always reach out to us. There's a contact form on the website. That's www.ariesfoundation.org. You know, or you can shoot us an email, right? The email is info@ariesfoundation.org. You've got a question on anything, you've got a concern dealing with your money and your finances, that's why we're here. We want to say thank you in another episode of Think with a Drink.
Let's go.